Welcome to another deep dive.
Yeah.
Today we're tackling something a lot of you have been asking about, how to strengthen and stabilize self-esteem, especially for women.
Yeah, that's a great topic.
We've got some really interesting material to work with today.
Oh, yeah.
We've got excerpts from Maja Storch's book, Die Sehnsucht der starken Frau nach dem starken Mann.
Okay.
And we also have this patient manual all about emotion regulation training.
Interesting. So we're mixing sort of psychological theory with like really practical techniques.
Exactly. Buckle up.
I'm ready.
Okay, so one thing that really stood out to me in your notes was this feeling of being stuck in the strong woman archetype,
Yeah.
but then still struggling with self-doubt.
Absolutely.
And Storch actually calls this the strong woman paradox.
Right.
Does that resonate with you?
Totally. It's like Storch's work really highlights how so many women, they're achieving all this success,
Right.
independent, but they still kind of harbor this like weak inner girl that's often shaped by, expectations from society and those early relationships, especially with fathers.
That's so interesting. So it's not just about external achievements.
Right.
It's about healing those deeper emotional wounds.
Exactly. And she doesn't shy away from like the hard stuff either. She argues that this inner girl can actually lead to self-sabotage in relationships,
Oh, wow.
pushing us towards the very men who are likely to reinforce those feelings of inadequacy.
Oh, that's so
Yeah,
interesting.
but that example she gives of the client who was drawn to the stereotypical Casanova, it like mirrored her yearning for validation from a distant father figure.
It's almost like we're drawn to recreate those early dynamics,
Totally.
even if they were hurtful.
And this can fuel that whole frustrating narrative of all men are pigs,
Right.
which obviously is a generalization,
Of course.
but it speaks to the pain and frustration that so many women experience.
Absolutely. So if we're stuck in this paradox, like what's the way out? You had highlighted Storch's emphasis on the power of tears, and I have to admit that surprised me.
It's definitely counterintuitive.
Yeah.
Like, we're so conditioned to see crying as weak,
Mm-hmm.
but Storch, like, flips the script, arguing that allowing ourselves to be vulnerable to express those emotions, it's actually a path to strength.
Okay, so how does that work practically? Does that mean like just letting the waterworks flow anytime I feel overwhelmed?
It's more nuanced than that. It's about creating a safe space to like truly feel our emotions,
Okay.
not suppressing them. And Storch observed that many strong women, like, they take years in therapy before they feel safe enough to actually cry in front of their therapist.
Oh, wow.
And that speaks volumes, about that fear of vulnerability that we carry.
Yeah. So it's about recognizing that inner girl and allowing her to express her pain, not trying to be stoic and strong all the time.
Yeah. And that actually leads to her next point, which is honestly even more challenging: embracing weakness as a path to strength.
Okay, that sounds like a recipe for getting walked all over. How can being weak possibly lead to strength?
Well, she argues that by acknowledging and embracing our vulnerability, instead of denying it, we open ourselves up to experiencing true helplessness.
So is that like admitting defeat, giving up?
Not at all. It's about recognizing we don't have to do everything on our own. And by experiencing true helplessness, we learn to ask for help, which is a crucial step towards like building self-reliance and healthy interdependence.
This reminds me of that time I tried to move a giant bookcase all by myself.
Uh-oh.
I swore I could do it, but I ended up with like a bruised ego and a sore back.
Yeah.
Maybe asking for help isn't surrendering.
Yeah,
It's a smarter way to get things done.
exactly. And Storch actually uses a really fascinating example to illustrate this concept: the fairy tale of the girl without hands.
Okay, that sounds intense. What's the connection to self-esteem?
So the girl loses her hands. It kind of symbolizes her agency, her control, and she endures hardship, but ultimately she achieves true autonomy and a complete female identity. So it's a really powerful metaphor for the idea that true strength can emerge from like surrendering to vulnerability and allowing ourselves to be supported.
So it's about recognizing that needing help isn't a weakness. It's part of being human, maybe even essential for growth.
Absolutely. It's a shift from a go-it-alone mentality to one of healthy interdependence. Now, the patient manual you provided takes a totally different approach.
Okay.
It focuses on practical techniques for emotion regulation.
Which makes sense. If we're constantly battling our emotions, it's hard to feel good about ourselves, right?
Exactly. And the manual highlights a technique called focusing.
Okay.
And it involves paying close attention to, like, the bodily sensations associated with your emotions, the tightness in your chest, the fluttering in your stomach.
So it's about becoming more aware of those physical cues instead of getting swept away by the thoughts.
Precisely. By noticing those sensations, you can start to understand and process those emotions without feeling totally overwhelmed by them.
It's like creating a little distance between the emotion and your reaction to it,
Exactly.
giving you more control.
Moving from reactivity to responsiveness.
I love that. This actually reminds me of something else you flagged from the manual,
Yeah.
identifying and rewriting what it calls dysfunctional rules. I know I have a few of those running on autopilot.
Oh, they're so common. Especially for women, these are those unconscious survival rules we develop in childhood
Right.
that dictate how we must behave to be loved and accepted. But, in adulthood, they become major roadblocks to self-esteem.
Like my personal favorite, I must always be perfectly put together to be worthy of love.
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
That's a perfect example. And, it probably stems from somewhere. Maybe you had a parent who was very critical of your appearance or something.
Bingo. My mom was obsessed with looking perfect.
Oh.
I guess I internalized that message.
So now, even though you're this successful, independent woman, that old rule's still running the show, leading to anxiety, that constant feeling of not being good enough.
So frustrating. But the manual suggests that we can actually rewrite these dysfunctional rules.
Yeah.
How does that work?
Well, it starts with awareness. Recognizing those rules, understanding where they came from, and then actively challenging, how valid they really are. And the manual provides exercises to help replace these limiting beliefs with healthier, more empowering ones.
So it's about questioning those old beliefs and choosing to believe something different.
Exactly. It's like creating a new internal operating system, one that supports your growth and well-being instead of holding you back.
I love that analogy. Now, the manual also spends a lot of time on self-care. I have to admit, that's one area where I really struggle. I always feel guilty prioritizing myself.
That's so common, though. We're often conditioned to put others' needs first. But, the manual emphasizes that self-care isn't selfish. It's essential for stable self-esteem. It's about recognizing that you deserve to feel good, both physically and mentally.
It's funny because I'd never think twice about telling a friend to take a break or do something nice for themselves. I guess I need to extend that same kindness to myself.
Exactly. Treat yourself with the same compassion and care that you would offer a loved one.
Now, one concept from the manual that I'm really curious about is this idea of building a supportive inner companion. What is that exactly?
So it's a really powerful technique for cultivating a sense of, inner support and guidance. It involves using visualization to create, an imaginary figure who embodies those qualities of compassion, wisdom, strength, almost like an inner mentor.
Yeah.
Or a wise friend who's always there to offer encouragement.
So it's like having your own personal cheerleader.
Exactly. And the manual actually provides exercises to help you connect with this companion, build that relationship, and then draw on its wisdom and support whenever you need it.
Oh, I'm so excited to try that. Now, another area that the manual delves into is something that I know a lot of women struggle with, and that's dealing with anger. We're often taught to suppress our anger, but the manual actually frames it as a healthy and even empowering emotion.
Absolutely. Anger is a natural response. When our boundaries are crossed, our needs aren't met, it's a signal that something needs to change.
But how do we express anger without becoming, the angry woman?
Yeah.
That stereotype can be so silencing.
That's a valid concern. The manual offers some really good guidance on how to identify the source of your anger, how to communicate your needs assertively, and how to set boundaries to protect yourself without resorting to aggression or blame. It's about using your anger as a catalyst for positive change.
So it's not about suppressing it or letting it control us.
Right.
It's about understanding it and channeling it in a healthy way.
Exactly. Reclaiming your right to be angry and using that anger to create a life that feels more authentic and aligned with your values. Now, another concept that both Storch's book and the patient manual address is this idea of the animus, or sometimes called the inner male figure.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting. You mentioned that understanding and working with our animus is crucial for building self-esteem.
It really is.
Can you explain why?
So in Jungian psychology, the animus represents It's like the unconscious masculine principle
Okay.
that exists within like the psyche of every woman. So it embodies those qualities of like assertiveness, independence, intellect, a drive towards action.
So it's not about men in the external world, but about an internalized image of the masculine
Yeah, exactly.
that we all carry within us.
And both Storch and the patient manual, they emphasize that if we're not conscious of our animus, it can actually project outward, leading us to seek those qualities in men.
It's like we're trying to complete ourselves through our partners,
Yeah.
rather than recognizing that we have those qualities within ourselves.
Exactly. And both sources suggest that by becoming aware of our animus and integrating its positive aspects, we can access those qualities directly.
So we can become more assertive, more independent,
Yeah.
more confident in our own abilities.
Exactly. Now, Storch gives some like really interesting examples of how the animus can actually manifest in a woman's life. She talks about the professor, the mafia boss, and the Turk.
Okay. Can you tell us a bit more about those figures?
Yeah. So they represent like these different archetypal expressions of the animus,
Right.
like the professor, for instance. He embodies like that intellectual side of the animus. He might represent like a woman's capacity for critical thinking, analysis, a love of knowledge.
So if a woman hasn't fully integrated this aspect of her animus, she might project it onto men,
Yeah.
seeking out partners who are like super intellectual
Right.
or who are constantly validating her intelligence.
That's a really common pattern. She might also, struggle to assert her own intellectual authority, like deferring to men's opinions or feeling insecure about sharing her own ideas. But by working with this professor archetype, she can learn to claim her own intellectual power,
Right.
and express her ideas with confidence.
It's about recognizing that she has that capacity for brilliance within herself.
Absolutely.
What about the mafia boss? He sounds a little intimidating.
He can be, yeah.
Uh-huh.
So he represents like the more assertive and, potentially aggressive side of the animus.
Okay.
He embodies those qualities of strength, determination, a willingness to take risks.
Which are all qualities that can be like incredibly valuable
Totally.
in achieving our goal.
Yes.
And creating a life that feels fulfilling.
But if the woman hasn't integrated this aspect of her animus, she might project it outward, attracting partners who are controlling or domineering. Or she might suppress her own anger, her assertiveness,
Right.
fearing she'll be seen as like unfeminine or too much.
So it's about learning to channel those qualities of strength and assertiveness in a healthy way, to set boundaries,
Yeah.
to speak your truth without fear.
Exactly. Recognizing that strength and assertiveness aren't weaknesses, they're powerful assets that can help her create a life that feels, aligned with her values.
Yeah. What about the Turk?
So the Turk is a little different. He embodies the more sensual and emotional side of the animus.
Okay.
He might represent, a woman's capacity for passion, creativity, a deep connection to her feelings.
This archetype seems to touch on those aspects of the feminine that are often suppressed or undervalued.
Absolutely. And if a woman hasn't integrated this part of her animus, she might project it onto men, seeking partners who are emotionally expressive,
Right.
or who can, awaken her own passion, or she might deny her own emotions, fearing that they'll be too overwhelming or make her seem, weak or needy.
So it's about embracing those qualities of passion, creativity, and emotional depth within herself, rather than seeking them from external sources.
Exactly. Recognizing that those qualities are not weaknesses. They're sources of power and aliveness. They can enrich her life in these profound ways.
This is already so insightful. How does the patient manual approach this concept of the animus in the context of building self-esteem?
Well, it emphasizes the importance of recognizing how our inner animus might be influencing our behavior, our choices,
Okay.
especially in relationships.
So becoming aware of those moments when we're projecting those animus qualities onto others or denying those qualities within ourselves.
Right. And it encourages us to explore those patterns with like curiosity, compassion,
Yeah.
recognizing they often stem from a deep desire to feel whole and complete.
It's about understanding those deeper motivations and then making conscious choices that are more aligned with our true selves.
Exactly. What are some of the specific techniques the manual suggests for working with the animus? It might involve journaling, visualization, or even like engaging in a dialogue with our inner animus figure.
A dialogue. So like having a conversation with that part of ourselves.
Exactly. Creating a relationship with that part of ourselves.
Right.
Rather than fearing it or rejecting it.
And that can help us integrate those qualities in a healthy way rather than projecting them outward or suppressing them.
Yeah. And when we integrate those qualities, we tap into this whole new level of strength, clarity, purpose. We become more capable of creating a life that feels, truly authentic, aligned with our deepest desires.
This is also fascinating. Now, both Storch's book and the patient manual talk about this technique called active imagination.
Yeah.
That can be really helpful for women working on strengthening their self-esteem.
Right.
What is that?
So it's a powerful tool for accessing and communicating with the unconscious mind.
Okay.
It was developed by Carl Jung, and it involves like creating this relaxed and receptive state of mind, and then inviting those inner figures or archetypes to emerge into consciousness.
So it's a bit like a guided meditation.
Yeah.
Where we're intentionally creating a space for our subconscious to speak to us.
That's a great analogy. And both Storch and the patient manual, they emphasize that this isn't about like making things up or forcing an outcome.
Okay.
It's about creating the conditions for our inner wisdom to reveal itself.
So trusting our own inner guidance and allowing those unconscious patterns to emerge.
Exactly. And it can be so revealing. For example, imagine a woman who's struggling with this pattern of attracting like emotionally unavailable partners. She might use active imagination to engage in a dialogue with her inner weak girl.
So like she might ask her inner girl questions like, what are you afraid of?
Yeah.
Or what do you need?
Precisely. And those answers can offer these profound insights into her early experiences. And it can reveal how she might be like unconsciously recreating those dynamics in her adult relationships.
It's like those early experiences created a blueprint for how she relates to men. And active imagination allows her to access and understand that blueprint.
You've got it. It's about bringing those unconscious patterns to light so she can start to make different choices.
Now, Storch and the patient manual both caution that this work can be challenging.
It can be, yeah.
Why is that?
Because it often involves facing those aspects of ourselves that we've like rejected or disowned, the parts that we deem, unacceptable or unlovable.
So it can be a little intimidating, like opening a door to a room you've kept locked for years, not knowing where you're going to find.
That's a great analogy. And both Storch and the patient manual emphasize that this work is like best done with the guidance of, a skilled therapist or a trusted mentor, someone who can provide that support and guidance through those intense emotional experiences.
So it's not about diving into the deep end without a life preserver.
Exactly. It's about having someone to guide you through the process, to help you navigate those challenging emotions, to make sense of what emerges. It's about trusting the process, knowing that even though it might be uncomfortable at times, it's ultimately leading us toward greater self-awareness, self-acceptance, and a deeper sense of wholeness.
That makes a lot of sense. Now, Storch's book offers some really compelling examples of how the inner weak girl can sabotage relationships. She talks about women becoming like overly accommodating or even adopting a victim role.
Yeah.
Can you elaborate on those dynamics?
Absolutely. So if a woman hasn't addressed those early wounds of feeling unseen, unloved, or unworthy, she might unconsciously seek out partners who reinforce those patterns.
So she might attract men who are like emotionally unavailable. Or even controlling because it feels familiar.
Exactly.
Even if it's not healthy.
It's like those early experiences, they create this template for love and connection.
Yeah.
And she might try to like win their love by being overly accommodating, always putting their needs before her own, constantly seeking their approval. It's like she's trying to prove her worth by being like good enough or by fixing them.
But that approach often backfires, right?
You're right. Because it leads to resentment, a loss of self. And ultimately, it reinforces those feelings of unworthiness.
It's like pouring energy into a bottomless pit.
Exactly. And what's even more heartbreaking is that it often pushes the partner away.
Oh, wow.
It creates this dynamic of neediness and dependence, rather than one of mutual respect and equality.
So instead of attracting a healthy, balanced partnership, she ends up attracting more emotional unavailability.
Often, yeah.
Oh,
It's like this self-fulfilling prophecy. And it can be so painful to recognize those patterns and to break free from them.
What about the victim role? How does that dynamic play out in relationships?
So sometimes when a woman feels like powerless or afraid to assert her needs directly, she might unconsciously adopt a victim stance.
So she might blame her partner for her unhappiness or feel helpless to change the situation.
Yes. And it's important to acknowledge that sometimes people are genuinely victims of abuse or mistreatment.
Of course.
But in these cases, the victim role is more about a subconscious pattern of avoiding, responsibility or confrontation.
So it's like a defense mechanism, a way to protect herself from feeling hurt or rejected.
You're exactly right. It can also be a way of seeking attention or sympathy.
Right.
But ultimately, it keeps her trapped in that cycle of powerlessness.
Because she's giving her power away to her partner rather than claiming it for herself.
That's a powerful insight. Storch emphasizes that true empowerment comes from recognizing those patterns, taking responsibility for our choices, and learning to communicate our needs directly, assertively.
So it's about shifting from a victim mentality to a creator mentality.
Yes.
Recognize that we have the agency to change our situation.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that we have the power to create the relationships and the life that we desire, rather than waiting for someone else to give it to us.
That's such a powerful reminder.
Yeah.
It's not about blaming ourselves for our past.
Right.
It's about taking responsibility for our present and our future.
Exactly. And recognizing that we have choices,
Yeah.
We might not have had control over our past experiences, but we have the power to choose how we respond to them now.
That's a message of self-empowerment and hope. Now, the patient manual that we've been exploring also offers some valuable insights into building, stronger and more stable self-esteem.
It is us.
And one of the things that really struck me about the manual was its emphasis on the importance of understanding and changing those dysfunctional survival rules that we often develop in childhood.
Right. Those survival rules are so powerful, and they can really undermine our efforts to build lasting self-esteem.
Yeah. They're almost like these hidden scripts that are running our lives.
Yeah. You're exactly right. They're like the unspoken rules of a game that we learned early on. And we continue to play by those rules.
Right.
Even when they're no longer serving us.
You mentioned earlier that they're essentially like deeply ingrained beliefs about how we need to behave in order to be loved, accepted, safe in the world.
Yes.
It's like a set of internal guidelines that we operate from,
Yeah.
often without even realizing it.
And a lot of times those beliefs are formed in response to our early childhood experiences.
Right.
It might be a belief like, I have to be perfect to be loved, or I can't show my anger, or I'll be rejected.
Right.
And while those beliefs might have served a purpose in childhood, maybe protected us from criticism or punishment, they can become incredibly limiting, self-defeating in adulthood.
Yeah, they can lead to those patterns of people-pleasing, perfectionism, self-doubt, a constant feeling of not being good enough.
And the heartbreaking thing is that these patterns often keep us from experiencing the love, connection, and fulfillment that we so deeply desire.
Oh, absolutely. So it's essential to bring those beliefs to light and to consciously choose to create new ones that are more aligned with our true selves.
Totally.
How does the manual suggest we go about doing that?
Well, the good news is that both Storch and the patient manual offer very specific guidance on how to recognize those dysfunctional rules, understand their origins, and then actively challenge and reframe them.
It's like we're talking about a process of transformation.
It is. The first step is awareness.
Okay.
It's about recognizing those moments when those old rules are running the show.
Okay.
You might notice yourself feeling anxious about making a mistake or going against someone's wishes. And in that moment, you can gently question the validity of that belief.
So instead of just reacting on autopilot, we're pausing to observe our thoughts and feelings.
Exactly. It's about creating that space between the stimulus and response, which gives us the power to choose how we want to respond.
And then, once we've identified those dysfunctional rules, what's the next step?
So the next step is to consciously choose to replace those limiting beliefs with ones that are more supportive of our growth and well-being. So instead of, I have to be perfect to be loved, it might be, it's okay to make mistakes. I'm worthy of love just as I am. Or instead of, I can't show my anger or I'll be rejected, it might be, it's healthy to express my anger in an assertive and respectful way. I deserve to have my needs met.
It's about shifting from that mindset of scarcity and fear to one of abundance and self-acceptance.
It's like rewriting those old scripts and creating a new internal blueprint that supports our authentic selves.
That's such a powerful image. Now, the manual also highlights the importance of practicing self-care as a foundation for building stable self-esteem.
It really is. Self-care is not about indulging in, bubble baths and spa days, although those can be lovely.
Of course.
It's about making that conscious effort to nourish ourselves on all levels, physically, emotionally, mentally, and spiritually.
And it's about recognizing that we are worthy of that care and attention.
Mm-hmm.
That by tending to our own needs, we're actually becoming more capable of showing up fully in the world.
Exactly. It's like tending a garden,
Yeah.
If we neglect to water and fertilize the soil, our plants will wither and struggle to thrive.
Right.
It's the same with ourselves. If we're constantly running on empty, neglecting our own needs, it's difficult to cultivate that strong sense of self-worth.
So what are some specific ways that women can practice self-care to support their self-esteem?
It can be as simple as making time for those activities that bring you joy, whether it's reading a book, taking a walk in nature, spending time with loved ones, or pursuing a creative hobby.
It's about making those activities a priority, not just squeezing them in when we have a spare moment.
You're right. It's about scheduling that time for ourselves, just like we would schedule, an important meeting or appointment.
Absolutely. It's about honoring our own needs, recognizing we deserve to feel good.
Self-care also involves nourishing our bodies with healthy food and movement.
So often when we're stressed or overwhelmed, we tend to neglect our physical needs. Like we might skip meals, reach for sugary treats, or become more sedentary.
It's understandable, but those choices ultimately deplete our energy and make it harder to manage that stress.
Right. So when we made those conscious choices to nourish our bodies with fresh, whole foods and regular movement, we're giving ourselves the fuel we need to thrive.
Exactly. And, it's not about depriving ourselves or striving for some unattainable ideal of perfect eating or exercise. It's about listening to our bodies and responding with kindness and care.
It's about finding those forms of movement that feel good in our bodies, that we can actually sustain over time.
And the manual also emphasizes the importance of getting enough sleep.
Oh, yes. This is a big one for me.
Right.
I always feel like there's not enough time in the day, so sleep is often the first thing to go.
Yeah.
Yeah. It's so common. But, when we chronically deprive ourselves of sleep, it takes a toll on our physical and emotional well-being. It affects our mood, our concentration, our energy levels, and even our immune system.
So it's not just about feeling tired. It's actually about undermining our ability to function optimally.
Exactly. And it makes it so much harder to regulate our emotions.
Right.
Which is, of course, essential for stable self-esteem. The manual suggests, establishing a regular sleep routine.
Okay.
Creating like a calming bedtime ritual. Making sure your bedroom's dark, quiet, cool, those sorts of things.
It's about creating those conditions for restful and restorative sleep.
Exactly. And giving yourself permission to rest and recharge without that guilt or judgment. It's also about, setting boundaries around our time and energy. Recognizing that we can't say yes to everything.
That's a big one for a lot of women. We're often socialized to be so accommodating.
Right.
To put others' needs before our own. But learning to set boundaries is essential for self-care. Absolutely. It's about recognizing it's okay to say no to requests, to demands that don't align with our values or our needs.
Right.
And it's about communicating those boundaries clearly, assertively, without guilt, without apology.
It's about standing up for ourselves, recognizing we deserve to be treated with respect.
And what's so interesting is that when we start prioritizing our own needs, when we start taking care of ourselves on all levels, we naturally become more confident, more radiant. It's like our inner light starts to shine brighter when we're giving ourselves that nourishment and care that we deserve.
I love that image. It's like recognizing that self-care isn't selfish. It's actually an act of self-love and empowerment.
Yeah, absolutely. Now, the manual also touches on the importance of cultivating positive social connections as a vital aspect of self-care.
Yeah, our relationships can be such a source of support and nourishment, but they can also be incredibly draining if they're not healthy, if they're not balanced.
You're right. It's not about the quantity of our relationships, but the quality.
Exactly. It's about being mindful of the people that we surround ourselves with and making sure that our relationships are reciprocal and supportive.
Yeah. So it's about nurturing those relationships that bring us joy, inspiration, laughter, a sense of belonging, and setting boundaries with those that drain our energy or bring us down.
Sometimes that might even involve letting go of relationships that are no longer serving us, even if it's painful.
That can be challenging. but it's often necessary for our growth, our well-being.
It's about creating a social circle that reflects our values and supports our, growth and well-being. Now, earlier we talked about a technique from the patient manual that I found particularly intriguing.
Oh, yeah.
This idea of creating a supportive inner companion.
Right.
Can you remind us what that is and how it can help us build self-esteem?
Yeah, it's a beautiful practice, really. So you use visualization to create like an imaginary figure who embodies qualities of compassion, wisdom, and strength. So kind of like an internal mentor, always there to offer that support, that encouragement.
And you mentioned that the manual has specific exercises to help us do this.
It does, yeah.
What might those look like? Because I'm a little skeptical, I have to admit, about just, conjuring up this helpful figure.
I understand the skepticism. It's not about like faking it, you know?
Right.
One of the exercises involves simply visualizing this companion. Like, what do they look like? How do they make you feel? You can even like write a dialogue with them, exploring questions or concerns you have. And the key is really consistency. The more you interact with this figure, the more like real and supportive they become.
So it's like we're building a relationship with that wise part of ourselves that we often ignore or push away.
And this inner companion, they're always there for us, no matter what. They don't judge. They don't offer unsolicited advice. They simply offer that love, support, and guidance. They can be such a powerful antidote to that inner critic that so many of us struggle with.
This is really making me rethink how we access strength. Storch's idea about embracing weakness.
Yeah.
And now this inner companion, it's like true power comes from aligning with these often like hidden parts of ourselves.
You're getting right to the heart of it. Both of these approaches really encourage us to stop battling against ourselves and instead tap into these sources of inner strength that are already there waiting to be acknowledged and embraced.
Now, another challenging topic that the manual tackles is facing and expressing anger. We touched on this briefly before, but it's worth revisiting. It's something so many women really struggle with.
Yeah.
I know I've often felt ashamed of my anger, tried to swallow it down or turn it inward.
It's so common. We're often conditioned to believe that anger is like unladylike or unattractive.
Right.
But the manual encourages us to reclaim our anger.
Okay.
To recognize it as a healthy and even empowering emotion.
But how do we do that without becoming, like out of control?
Yeah.
Or hurting others with our anger?
Yeah, that's a good question. The key is learning to express anger in a healthy and constructive way.
Okay.
And the manual provides some really helpful guidance on that.
Yeah.
It talks about identifying the source of our anger, like what need isn't being met, what boundary has been crossed, and then communicating those needs clearly, assertively.
So it's not about exploding or blaming.
No.
It's about owning our anger and expressing it in a way that honors our needs and respects the other person.
Precisely. It's about shifting from that reactive mode to a responsive mode. And, it's also about recognizing that expressing anger authentically can actually strengthen relationships.
Well, interesting.
It can, clear the air, foster greater understanding, and ultimately lead to more fulfilling connections.
I'm starting to see how all of these concepts, from embracing vulnerability to working with our animus to expressing our anger, it's all, intertwined.
It is, yeah.
It's about claiming our wholeness, both the light and the shadow, and recognizing that all parts of ourselves are worthy of love and acceptance.
You've beautifully summed up the essence of these teachings. It's about moving beyond those limiting, societal expectations.
Yeah.
And embracing the full complexity of who we are as women. And as we do that, we naturally cultivate a deeper sense of self-worth, self-love.
And that self-love becomes the foundation for creating a life that feels, authentic, joyful, deeply fulfilling.
Absolutely. And it's about recognizing that we don't have to choose between being nice and being powerful, Yeah. We can be both.
It's about embracing that full spectrum of our emotions, recognizing that they all have a purpose and a place in our lives.
Well, it seems like we've covered a lot of ground today.
We have.
Exploring some really profound and practical tools for strengthening and stabilizing self-esteem in women, from, unpacking that strong woman paradox to diving into the nuances of emotion regulation, challenging those limiting survival rules, and even exploring the power of our anger, we've really delved into the complexities of this topic.
I feel like we've barely scratched the surface,
Right.
but in a good way.
Yeah.
And I have to say, I'm feeling incredibly inspired. Like, I want to start putting some of these tools and insights into practice.
Yeah.
But before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, I'd love to hear, like, what final thought you would leave our listeners with today as they continue on their journey of self-discovery and empowerment.
That's a great question. I would just echo what we've been talking about today, which is to remember that true strength often lies in embracing those parts of ourselves that we've been taught to, hide or reject.
Mm.
It's in those like vulnerable, messy, perfectly imperfect places that we discover our authentic selves and our true power.
So beautifully said. And it's a reminder that the journey to, self-love and acceptance, it's not a linear path. It's filled with twists and turns, ups and downs.
It is, yeah.
But it's in those moments of challenge when we choose to meet ourselves with compassion and courage that we truly grow and evolve.
And those very qualities, compassion and courage, those are really the cornerstones of like strong and stable self-esteem.
And that's where our deep dive ends for today. But as always, we encourage you to keep exploring. Reflect on what resonated with you the most from today's conversation and consider, like, what small step you can take today to cultivate that deeper sense of self-worth. Perhaps it's trying that focusing technique that we talked about to become more aware of your emotions. Maybe it's having a conversation with your inner companion, or maybe it's simply giving yourself permission to, rest and recharge without that guilt or judgment. Whatever it is, remember that every step you take towards self-love is a step towards creating a life that feels more authentic, joyful, and aligned with your true self.